afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you from the States, and a special thank you to you for agreeing to start your day with us today. We're going to be considering the response of churches to George Floyd's murder a year ago, and indeed the wider societal response. If you'd like to put questions and make comments, please put them in the chat box, and I'll either field them for you or come to you so that you can put your question directly. I'm actually going to start the conversation today with Chine McDonald. She's the author of the book God is Not a White Man, which is going to be published next week. Chine, you were midway through writing your book when George Floyd was murdered. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about the effect that that had on your writing process, and how your thinking was perhaps changed or challenged by what had happened.
Yeah, so my book had been kind of percolating in my head for actually a few years, and I wanted to write a book that told the story of the church and racism, but from a Black British female perspective, a voice that kind of has rarely been heard on these issues. And for me, actually writing through that moment in history was absolutely the right moment for me to be writing. And I'm really glad that I hadn't finished it before, because as we saw, George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement sparked not just a protest, but a lot of soul searching, a lot of questions, a lot of conversations about race, from politics to arts to sport, but also within the church. And obviously we know that racial injustice had been with us for centuries. And what it told us was that this issue was much more urgent potentially than we had thought. And so in some ways I had this kind of skeleton structure of a book, but the process of writing through George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter protest really reshaped actually the lens through which I wrote the book. So for me, over that process, I kind of devoured books about Black history and also about Black theology, books by Black theologians. And Black liberation theology, I think, fundamentally reshapes the lens through which you see the church and the Christian faith. And for me, even more so, the Christian faith needed to be kind of rescued from this idea of power and empire and white superiority and white supremacy that it had been aligned with, and needed to be kind of retold through the lens of a Christ who sides with the marginalized and the oppressed. I think there were lots of things that I learned over that period, lots of kind of historical kind of articles and books that I uncovered that really kind of was a really emotional process. So for example, I was writing the book while researching for the book, and I saw and read this article, this pamphlet that had been written by a guy called Charles Carroll in 1900, and that it was called Is the Negro a Beast or Made in the Image of God? And I remember kind of breaking down at that point, because as a writer on racial justice, you have to come face to face with this trauma. And I think what George Floyd's murder showed us was that somewhere in the subconscious, some people still saw Black people as lesser in that same way as they did in 1900.
Thank you. Chine is going to supplement some of my questions of our guests as we go on in this session. First, I'd like to go to Patrick Ngonwolo, who is pastor at Resurrection Houston. And Patrick, you were a friend of George Floyd. I wonder what the mood is around you as this anniversary approaches.
Well, thank you for having me. I think the mood has been what it's been probably for the last year or so. We seem to be stuck in the middle of a suspense thriller. Not sure what is going to happen next, but hoping that whatever happens next is good. Because I think, and I talked about this last year with some people who asked me, the death of George Floyd has brought our country and dare I say, lots of the international world, I think particularly the Western world, to an inflection point. We're either going to master the original sin of racism, or it is going to master us. And so I think people like me and other just people are just wondering, are we going to what we're going to do from here? Uh, the thoughts from this this execution set me on a path where I was trying to discover and figure out where do we go from here. And I sat with leaders from all across the country, all different types of faith and perspectives, and tried to build a discursive podcast called the Kinfolk Podcast. And in that, just trying to discover where do we go from here. And I think the consensus was we need to have national and possibly international dialogue about the issue of race, and we need to figure out what type of country and what type of world do we want to be.
Is there a nervousness that there might be protests and police reactions to protests that might just spark some violence or just general unrest next week, or do you think that's unlikely?
I think that what things like the murder and execution of George Floyd tap into is a long-held, deep unrest. King wrote about it in Why We Can't Wait, and I think ever so often the lid is taken off, and we can see the anger that results when people are not heard and when people are not marginalized. And so I think whether it's next week or the week after, you're going to continue to see the type of unrest, the type of protest that exists when people feel like they've not been heard.
So I wondered what the role of the Black church in the protests and what followed George Floyd's murder has been, especially given the fact that in some senses it might feel like deja vu if you look at Emmett Till's murder or Rodney King's or etc. What has been the role and the place of the Black church in these past months?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question, because I think the role of the Black church is one, to speak plainly about the truth as it is and as we see it. And I guess in the Christian story, we call that the death, because in the death you are having to say, look, this thing is ugly, it is real, and it is something that has killed us. But then I think on the other end, because I think atheistic tendencies can also speak to the fact that racism is real and it kills. But I think the other role of the Black church is not only speaking truth about what the death is, but speaking truth about the resurrection, that there is hope, even though it looks bleak, and that regardless of whether America or whatever Western power gives it to us, because of the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, we have proof that God is doing something, and that in the particular example where an innocent man who was brutalized by state-sponsored terrorism, Jesus Christ, God said, no, I'm going to vindicate my son, reverse that death sentence, and raise him from the dead. And it is because of that we have hope to know that God can do the same thing in the instance of George Floyd, and also with a larger perspective, with all of us who feel like we've been unheard, marginalized, and killed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Could I bring in two US journalists here, Bob Smetiana from the Religion News Service and Robert Downen from the Houston Chronicle. Bob, what do you think the mood will be like next week?
It's a good question. It's kind of been drowned, I think, in the post-Trump era, because Trump's is kind of dominating the headlines right now with the kind of loyalty tests in the Republican Party, and then all the sort of post-pandemic lifting of kind of getting out of lockdown. It'll be interesting to see. One of the things that we see here a lot, the biggest news we're seeing on the issue of race is in churches is pushback, particularly in the Southern Baptist Convention, where there was a resolution back in 2019 about critical race theory, which has become a flashpoint, and this kind of protest movement of folks who think the Southern Baptist Convention is getting liberal. And I had a minister, a prominent Southern Baptist former seminary president, tell me this past week everything was great with race in the Southern Baptist Convention till they brought up CRT, and now we're all divided. So there's kind of a lot of pushback in that denomination, which is what the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S. And there's a lot of interest. It's become kind of a philosophical debate about critical race theory, and rather than an actual looking at the racial issues in the country. And this, so we just saw this week Russell Moore, who was at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, who'd been talking about race, who did a big event back in 2018 on Martin Luther King's 50th anniversary. He was seen as a liberal force, and so he left this week. He was basically pushed out the door or made to feel unwelcome in that denomination. So there's we're kind of waiting and seeing how big this pushback will be, because they're meeting this summer to talk about CRT and other issues. One thing I did see interesting, I was talking to a small, Robert will have a lot to share, but I was talking to a small town pastor whose people, I think, because of the pandemic and the election, and are just weary. And so you have folks who all of a sudden have realized that everything is not as great in their community as they thought it was. They thought racism was done. And so now they feel like they're the bad people and they don't want to talk about it. So there's been a withdrawing. There've been a lot of congregations that talk about this, but there's been kind of also this pushback and withdrawing.
Robert, would you like to come in? I mean, I wonder whether, first of all, what the implications are for the Southern Baptists that they've been tearing themselves apart over this, and what that means for the denomination, but also whether the discussions within the SBC reflect wider discussions within other Christian denominations.
I definitely don't think it's specific to the Southern Baptist Convention. I think that the racial justice and reconciliation aren't the only things that obviously the Southern Baptist Convention is dealing with right now, but they all, a lot of these, the abuse issue that we've written a lot about as well, it does kind of actually center on a lot of these conversations about power dynamics and who wields it in the church, and, when to say what and when, et cetera. I think one of the things that's been interesting as a reporter, especially based in Houston throughout this, has been conversations I've had with I think one of the really important things that people fail to understand is that just the way that a lot of white Protestants think about systemic racism in general. I think there was a study from Barna last year that talked about it, where white evangelicals basically, I think it was something effect of 60% of them basically they see racism as a problem of individual sin rather than within the context of systemic injustice. And I think that's going to be, their views on that were, directly opposite of the way that most Black Christians think about these things. And so I think that's going to be one of the really interesting and difficult challenges for not just Southern Baptists, but many predominantly white congregations going forward, is how to juggle this, the growing awareness, I guess, would be a probably speculative way to say it, but growing awareness of systemic racism within the context of their faith that does kind of teach in a way that this is that Derek Chauvin was a bad apple, and that him going to jail is an indication that the system is fine. So
maybe a question to Bob and Robert, whoever wants to come in. I draw quite heavily in my book on kind of recent books that have been written. For example, Robert Jones's White Too Long, and Kristen Kobes-Dumay's Jesus and John Wayne, and draw on that kind of the alignment of Christianity with white supremacy and nationalism that divides along political lines. I'm kind of keen to know, in the wake of George Floyd, whether you have examples or whether you have sensed any of the kind of evangelical churches changing their views on racial justice, or have they become more entrenched over this period because of the protest?
Probably both. I would think it's probably both. You have evangelical churches talking more about race. They're even small town churches in kind of white areas are talking about it and more. I think you also seen in evangelical circles more Black voices being raised and speaking. I know for reporters, we do report a lot on this. I think there's also been the withdrawal and hardening. I think this whole CRT debate in the Southern Baptists has been. I mean, there's a new some of the critics of the CRT, some of the critics of who say the Southern Baptist Convention is become too liberal have started a new petition called Southern Baptists Against Racism, which is basically to talk about racism. They have a petition, but the gist of it is if you talk about systemic racism, you are actually racist. So it's been kind of so there's been kind of a blatant, pretty strong endorsing that everything was fine, and if you talk about this, you are the problem. I think that one other thing that's kind of interesting is I think two things. There's been a growth in multiracial churches, and especially evangelical churches, but even there, those churches which have a more diverse congregation are white dominant, and so they're having those discussions about this. And then I think you have a real interesting movement. There's a group called The Witness, which is run by Jamar Tisby, who's an author and Christian pastor. There was a piece in the New York Times a couple years ago called The White Exodus, which was about Black members of mostly white spaces leaving. And so they have started a new thing called Leave Loud, which are Black Christians who had been in white spaces and just are leaving and telling everyone about it. So you could see you could see an exodus of people who had been in diverse congregations and say, this is not any different, and we're going to go make our own new thing.
Robert or Patrick, do you want to add anything to that? Patrick,
I'll defer to Patrick.
Patrick, I'm interested in the comment that Robert made about the understanding of sin. It's a few bad apples. It's their individual sin rather than anything systemic that's going on. I mean, is that something that the Black churches are critiquing?
Well, I mean, the fact that we have a Southern Baptist church historically was because it divided or reconvened around the issue of race. And so you're having congregations, all of us, Black, white, multiracial, we're all having to go back and I think it's a deeply spiritual thing. And with my wife, whenever I have an issue with her, eventually we have to sit down. And a lot of times it's my fault. I have to repent. And so I think it's an issue of real repentance that I believe God is calling our churches to some type of reckoning. And, as the biblical stories will say, either our hearts get tender or we get hardened. And I think to Bob's point, that's what we're seeing in America. Some people saying, and I think all over the world, really, some people saying, no, I'm digging in. We're going to go to the red herring of CRT, which, and I think it's a red herring because fundamentally what Black and brown people are asking for is treat me as someone who was created in the image of God.
Can I just ask, before I move to some of our UK guests, Robert or Bob, just the sort of denominations that we're familiar with here, the Episcopalians, the Catholics, is any shift there in their conversation? Are they tackling and changing things within their own structures as a response to this, and particularly the Catholics?
It's interesting. So some of the more like the Episcopal Church in the U.S. would be more open to talking about race. It's a very white denomination. So the mainline churches in the U.S., the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Episcopalians are all I think would be more progressive and more open to conversations of race. They're also they're much more white than the Southern Baptist Convention. So, and all those denominations. So this is what we don't get in the U.S. So Episcopalians, the Methodist, Presbyterians, they all split during the Civil War. We all know about the Southern Baptists who split. The Southern Baptist Convention was formed by, it's really a dispute over slaveholding missionaries. So churches wanted to send out missionaries who held slaves. Northern churches said, no, if you own slaves, you're sinning. And Southern churches said, no, we're not. And so they had a biblical defense. But the Methodists split during the Civil War, the Presbyterians split, the Episcopalians split, everybody split. And all those denominations have split off groups, which were Black Christians who weren't, given a place in those denominations. So they're a little more open to talking about this. The Catholic Church is different because it's actually much more, it's the most diverse church in the US because of, and large and mostly Hispanic. So Black Catholics are getting some like there's a Black Archbishop of DC who's the first, who's probably the most prominent Black Catholic in the country.
Thank you. Just turning now to home, and Bristol was a particular focus of the Black Lives Matter protests with the toppling of the Colston statue. The Rev Cathy Okoronkwo is the Bristol Bishop's race advisor, the Anglican Bishop race advisor. Cathy, can you tell us the story of how you became her advisor?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Something really happened in me when I saw that awful televised image, the killing of George Floyd. For sure, I knew that Black men and women are being killed every day on the streets of America, particularly around police brutality. You just can't get away from the reality of racism when you've lived in the States as I have. But when George Floyd was killed, it caused such a visceral response in me that I literally had to get out of the house. I think I went for a run or for a walk, and then spent some time writing a reflection and a poem that I wanted to share with the diocese. So in a sense, something really shifted in me or within me when George Floyd was murdered. And so around the whole landscape of the Black Lives Matter protests and the Colston statue being toppled over, in that space of a seemingly reawakened consciousness, because this isn't a conversation that's new, this has been going on for years and years and years. I had a conversation with Bishop of Bristol, Bishop Viv, and shared my desire to do something, to respond in some way, and particularly in the Diocese of Bristol, where there's been such a difficult relationship with the race conversation. And so I spoke to her about wanting to support my minority ethnic colleagues, shared my reflection and my poem, and we began that conversation in terms of how do we make racial justice a priority in the Diocese of Bristol. And on the back of that conversation, and amongst many other discussions, and in light of Bishop Viv having made a commitment to the work of racial justice, I was soon appointed the Bishop's advisor on racial justice in the diocese.
That might seem that Bristol's a bit ahead of other dioceses, because we now know through the Archbishop's Anti-Racism Task Force that every diocese is going to have such a post. I mean, how much do you think the task force recommendations are going to take things forward for the church? And supplementarily, might that make an effect outside of the church as well as within it?
Well, the hope is that we are going to be proactive in our response to the task force reports. The report sets out 47 specific action points in different arms of the Church of England to implement in 5 priority areas, and that's participation, governance, training, education, and young people. We still have a long way to go, and there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of issues around, how we are going to resource some of these action points, but we are committed. And the hope is that we can be a voice into the more wider space in terms of the public space, so that we're not just making change for the church, but we're actually making change so that the wider communities and other spaces can look to the church and see that we hold integrity in this conversation.
Chine, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, just keen to know what are the types of things that you've been doing in Bristol to engage in these conversations, maybe some examples to other dioceses who might want to follow.
Thank you, Chine, for your question. So as soon as I became Bishop's advisor on racial justice, and on the back of Bishop Viv's commitment, we set up a racial justice steering group, which was looking at some of the key areas that Bristol Diocese needs to really consider and reflect on and think through in terms of governance, in terms of policies, in terms of structures, et cetera, that need to be reviewed. And also, we've now just established a racial justice advisory group, which will now progress the task force report, mapping out some of those recommendations and seeing how that will we can actually proactively progress some of those action points. We also have a training group that's focused on diversity and cultural types of training that we're rolling out across the diocese from different angles. So in terms of clergy, in terms of lay people, in terms of recruitment. The cathedral has begun some really good work in terms of contested histories and memorials, and they've begun their auditing process there. And also more locally, we've got some diversity vocations champions trying to encourage people of all colour to engage with the Church of England, thinking about vocations, laity and ordained ministry.
And I know you've got a sort of poetry festival coming up at the cathedral as well, haven't you, which is going to reflect on some of the issues of Black Lives Matter. Just before we hear about some of the other things that are going to be happening in this country next week, David Muir wants to come back on something that Robert said. David is from the National Church Leaders Forum and the head of Whitelands College. Do you want to unmute yourself, David, and come in?
Thank you, Rosie. I was particularly interested in what Catherine said earlier on. I mean, I'm very hopeful about what the Church of England is doing. Of course, as the first Black head of college in 180 years, I know that I've got a lot of work to do in terms of historical monuments. And therefore, I was a bit disappointed when last week, I think it was, the former Bishop of Rochester, Nazir Ali, was bemoaning Church House and Archbishop of Canterbury for taking the actions that they've taken. And of course, there's this, as I think Robert said, about this kind of, straw man, I think, about CRT. CRT is not Marxism informed. CRT is critical theory that takes race seriously. And therefore, I think we just got to be careful that often, the wrong things play into the mix. But Robert, one of the things that I'm still fascinated about, and of course, as a Black British political theologian and educator, we actually train pastors, students, and teachers here, and we are still fascinated by the fact that 82% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, and it seems to me that white Christians in America have almost got to do what I think Patrick was actually intimating. They cannot be renewal unless there is repentance. And white Christians have actually benefited from the deformation of Black flesh for hundreds of years. And the church has actually been one of the key partners in that. So I think, if George Floyd's death is going to teach us anything, and I hope that it actually does, that is going to help us as Christians to be prophetic in our witness, where we do actually challenge one another to be historically truthful, but also to ask ourselves, what are we going to actually do to fundamentally help to bring about change? And I like what Spurgeon talked about, from the book of Nehemiah. We've got to engage in the sword and trowel. Some of us have got to continue advocating and fighting, but we've also got to think about constructive ways to actually build. And I'm encouraged by the recent Church of England report, because I see there is an admission that things have gone horribly wrong for decades, and they are very, very keen to do something about it. And therefore, those who are going on about CRT only don't understand it, but they're actually missing the point.
I don't know if anyone wants to come back on that. If you do, just unmute yourself and shout. I'll give 5 seconds, and then I'll move on, and we can perhaps come back to some of those things later. Does anyone want to respond to that?
There's an interesting, the sword and trowel caught my eye. There's one of the groups that is called Founders Ministry in the Southern Baptists, who are very anti-CRT. Their podcast is called The Sword and Trowel, and they're very there's an interesting thing going on in churches here. There's kind of an admission that things were terrible in the past and they're better now. And I think there's two things I would say have changed in the last year. One is there's almost no time when there's a police shooting where someone from a church or other group is not paying attention. People could be shot and killed, Black people could be shot and killed, and no one would notice in the past. I think, or churches certainly wouldn't be noticing, and they are now. That's different. I don't know how long it will last. And there is kind of a lot more understanding because we have more multiracial churches, because we have a lot more transracial adoption here. We have a lot more people in churches whose families or circles of friends are more diverse, and so those folks are like, wait a sec. But we're facing why people voted for Donald Trump is evangelicals are mostly Republican, they're mostly Southerners. So we have sorted ourselves in the U.S. geographically by not just religion and race, but also by politics. So folks who are evangelical are probably living in a red state. And so they voted for Trump because Trump is the Republican person, and because they think the other party are the devil. So,
if anyone wants to come in, it helps if you just send me a message in the chat box, and I'll make sure that you do. But I'd like to just turn our attention a bit to a couple of things that are happening in the UK next week. Mike Royals, a Pentecostal bishop based in Birmingham, and Mike, you're speaking partly on behalf of Churches Together in England. You've got a moment of action on Tuesday at noon, I think.
Yeah, no, very much. It's a moment where we'll be lighting candles and remembering the death of George Floyd. It's a moment to lament. And it's a moment also to reflect on where we've come, the progress that has been made, and I think that progress has been made, but also how far we've got to go as well. And so that will be an important moment for people individually or now collectively. Now lockdown is easing, to come together and to remember his death.
Can I ask you the sort of momentum for this? Was this Church of England or different churches together in England, the leaders saying, well, we really need to do something, or did you have members of your congregation saying, what are we doing? I mean, where did the impetus come from?
I think the impetus has been building for a while, and of course, although the death of George Floyd is something that's happened in the American context, it lit a touch paper here. And so myself and a number of leaders in the UK, we arranged a protest outside the Houses of Parliament in London. We marched down Whitehall through to Trafalgar Square. We stopped at 10 Downing Street, and we made our voices heard. We then arranged a petition. So this is something that's been building for a while, and we anticipated that this moment, this anniversary moment, would be a moment to reflect. And what I'm heartened by is the fact that there are groups of churches and individual churches and Christian organisations in the UK who are now leaning into this agenda. Some of them have been slow, but they are leaning into this agenda. Even as I speak, I can see flashing up on my phone invitations to come and speak at racial justice events. So I'm heartened by that. What I want to see, though, and this is really important, I want to see churches engaging at an appropriate depth. This can't just be about unity. It has to be about holding a moment of tension and saying, we really need to do better. How are we going to move forward in terms of auditing our organisations and changing people's attitudes?
So work going on much beyond the anniversary. Richard Reddy, you're Director for Justice and Inclusion for the Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. A similar response, I presume, to Mike in terms of where the interest in holding some sort of event is coming from. Just tell us what it is that you've organised, please.
Yeah, so the event that I've worked to organise is called Doing Justice, and it's a church service. And it's an opportunity for Christians from all traditions and denominations in England, in Scotland, Ireland, and Ireland is one jurisdiction for us, as well as Wales, to remember, to reflect, and to respond, to remember the life of George Floyd, and also lives cut short, particularly in this country, by violence, particularly violence within a sort of a police context. And then we're also going to reflect on the ongoing issue and the importance of racial justice in this country, and also respond by actively working to tackle racism and injustice in both church and society. So, you know, for us, it's about the 3 R's, it's education. It's all about ensuring that this issue, now that it's on the agenda, remains on the agenda. Because one of the ironies is that, or one of the cruel ironies is that, last year marked the 25th anniversary of Racial Justice Sunday in Britain and Ireland. And Racial Justice Sunday first came about because of the racist killing of Stephen Lawrence in 1993. And that in and of itself was a Kairos moment. And that was one of the issues that put racial justice on the church's agenda. But for many of us, 25 years, this issue has been off the agenda. And I always use the term before George Floyd and after George Floyd. And before George Floyd, churches were reticent, they were hesitant about talking about this issue. After George Floyd, it seems as if it's part of a zeitgeist. Everybody wants to talk about racial justice now, which I think is a good thing, but talk is cheap. That's why we call our thing Doing Justice, because the thing about justice is that you do it, you don't talk it. Talk is cheap, as my mum would always say. So what we're saying to the churches is that the journey that they, many of them embarked upon last year, where are they this year? And the service is very much about, I wouldn't say holding churches to account, but saying, the journey must continue. This issue of racial justice is everyone's business and it's unfinished business. And what we started off last year, we need to continue this year. If we're really in it, we have to be in it for the long haul. It's not a fashionable thing. It's about equality, it's about parity, it's about justice. So that's what we're seeking to do.
And the service that you're hosting is on Tuesday at 7 on the CTBI's YouTube channel, and I believe BBC Radio 4 are going to be taking it for their service the following Sunday. Chine, you wanted to ask a question of Patrick.
Yes, I was just reflecting on what Richard just said about before George Floyd and after George Floyd. And I wonder, Patrick, what that must feel like for you as someone who knew him, as someone who, people are now kind of marking time against. And I wonder whether you have a sense of why George Floyd is the one that made this difference, or his killing made this difference, considering this is a regular thing that happens in America and has been happening in the UK too? What was it about that particular moment and his death?
Thank you for the question. Well, I think if you look at it scientifically, one of the things that I think makes it interesting is that this death was particularly public. It was on video. It was long. It was agonizing. It was excruciating. We've had most of the time these killings on public. Sometimes they're on video, but this one I think was so dramatic. Was so long. I mean, to watch somebody publicly executed for 9 minutes and 30 seconds as they cry out for their mother and cry out for what all of us tend to take for granted, at least I do, which is to breathe. I think it just had a resonating effect. I think in the spirit realm, so to speak, I think that, you know, in the States, if somebody were to say, well, somebody of my hue and complexion were to say, man, who's out here, who would God champion to help us with racial justice? We might say, I don't know, at least I would say LeBron James. We'd pick some celebrity, someone who's Black, someone who has status and money and clout and the ability to raise and stand on their own platform. But as God would often have it, he does things his particular way. Back in the day, he chose a carpenter from Nazareth, and here he decides he's going to do something that only he can do so that he can get the glory. He chooses what we call a brick boy from the CUNY Homes Housing Project in 3rd Ward, Houston, Texas. And so, and he chooses that person to move the movement forward. And I think that is God. It is indicative of how God works. He doesn't use the up and ins. He uses the down and outs. And I'm so happy, bittersweet, I guess, because you never want to see, you never want to see, someone so full of life, someone who championed the cause of folk having and getting redemption. Personally, I witnessed this. And just even if he did none of those things, just the fact that he's a human being, you never want to see somebody die such a humiliating, awful, excruciating death, or die, period. But I think what gives me some hope is that I don't believe his death was in vain.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, I suppose the question there is, how do we know 5 years hence that it wasn't? You know, what are the yardsticks which we can use to measure whether something has indeed changed as a result of what happened? I wonder if anyone would like to come in on that. Just unmute yourselves and come in.
At the University of Roehampton, 64.4% of the students are Black, Asian, and majority ethnic. Many of those students participated in the Black Lives Matter campaign. They wrote things, they pressured the Vice Chancellor to do things. And therefore, next Tuesday, we're going to be celebrating the anniversary of George Floyd's death. In all of this, I think what we are desperately trying to do, and I think I just put something in the chat, is not to waste another defining moment. In Britain, I remember as a student during the Scarman days, 1982, when police brutalized Black people in Brixton, we had a judge-led report. We thought that was going to change things. 11 years later, we had Stephen Lawrence, 1993. He was brutally murdered, a stone's throw away from where I actually live in Greenwich. We thought that would have been a defining moment. We seem to have almost gone backwards in America, we were fascinated when Barack Obama became the president. We almost, got a bit hazy about the so-called post-racial America. And then we got Trump. What am I trying to say? Well, I'm trying to say two things. First and foremost, Christians have a moral responsibility, not just to see Black lives as an elegant political slogan, but Black Lives Matter is a biblical and a political imperative. And the second thing is this, we know how the media works. And maybe the following Tuesdays from now, we will forget about George Floyd. We have students at our universities whose lives have been radically changed and altered. Many of us, I included, have been traumatized, still seeking therapy. We have been brutalized by this. It actually behoves us as Christians to almost be Augustinian in our response. And what is that response? To realize that we've got to have anger and hope. Anger about the way things are and hope to do something about them. And I think, if we can all ask ourselves what we can do and what we must do personally to make sure that George Floyd, another Black man, brutally lynched, assassinated publicly, doesn't go wasted. I must confess, I don't have a lot of hope when I think about the history of white evangelicals, but I know that God does amazing things and who knows what can happen. But unless they repent, we're going to end up where we are.
Anyone like to comment on that? I don't know if any of you would like to comment.
Thank you for that, David. That's so much wisdom there. I think that, we have seen, I have never seen something like this before. So I do have hope that what happened following George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter protests will have repercussions. But I think the place that I find hope is actually in the young people. And I think that it's a lesson to the church and the church's mission. If the church wants to continue into the next decades and centuries, they have to be a place that addresses these issues of injustice, whether that's gender injustice, being a place that is welcoming and inclusive of all people. Because young people are not going to stand for it, and they're not going to go to churches where white supremacy is kind of dominant or where people are excluded. So I think that the church has to play a leading role in making this change happen in order for its mission to continue into the future.
Cathy Okoronkwo, do you want to come in? Because there's the Church of England report was from lament to action, and the action has been laid out. But the role of the arts in lament, protest, prophetic witness, I think you would be wanting to sort of fight for that, wouldn't you?
Yes, certainly. As I started, one of the key ways in which I responded to the trauma of the killing of George Floyd was to write a poem. And one of the things that I've done is to seek a creative space in which we can have more conversations across the generations around this difficult discourse. And so we have set up the inaugural Cathedral Poetry Competition. And it's interesting that the submissions window is happening now. It wasn't really planned as such, but it's interesting how God's Spirit has planned it to connect with this time. And the deadline for that competition is June the 30th. And then following that, there will be a festival at the Cathedral during Black History Month on the 14th of October. And I think a lot of the speakers have spoken about this whole thing, about it needs to go deeper than just a surface response. And this needs to be a long-lasting or ongoing conversation and acting, and many actions rather. So that is one way in which we're trying to do that in terms of Bristol Diocese.
Thank you. Richard, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, just to sort of echo what David has said, and we've got to avoid this sense of deja vu, because within the church, we had the death of, in Britain anyway, we had the death of the murder of Stephen Lawrence, and many of the historic or mainstream denominations established racial justice officers. And these men and women were tasked to take forward the church's work on racial justice. And what we saw after about 10 years, particularly in the noughties, were that those posts were either abolished or they morphed into equality, diversity, and inclusion roles, where they sort of, the race basically just slipped off the agenda. But, you know, what we saw as a result of that was that the church was not in a position to respond to key public policy issues in Britain around racial justice and equality. So, for instance, you know, where was the voice of the church on the Windrush scandal? Where was the voice of the church on the hostile environment? Where was the voice of the church on the Grenfell Tower fire? You know, where was the voice of the church when, and I'm not critiquing how people voted during Brexit, but what we did see with Brexit was a massive spike in racial and religious reported hate crime. Church had nothing to say. And because it had taken race off the agenda, it wasn't in a position to respond to those issues. I think what we really need to ensure is that, you know, we're at a watershed moment. Some have used the term Kairos moment. You know, I pray that we don't see anything like George Floyd again, but, you know, chances are racism didn't begin with him. It won't end with him. But, you know, how will the church respond to those key issues? Is it in the right place? Is it in the right position to prophetically speak into those situations? Or will it be reactive, as it's been for many years? You know, it doesn't sort of speak prophetically, it doesn't speak proactively. It sort of responds and reacts to what takes place. Yeah,
thank you. I mean, actually, there's something from Bob in the chat box about government response rather than church response, and how the UK government's responded to calls for racial justice, and whether there's been pushback in their response in sort of labelling protests as riots and so on. And we have had one government report which might be interpreted as pushback in sort of denying that institutional racism exists. Chine, I don't know if you've got some final thoughts about that, on what a sort of government response has been over the last year, and where that is either to be commended or wanting.
I'd say it's to be found wanting. And the institutional racism report that was brought out, it did cause quite a lot of uproar, because it basically said institutional racism no longer exists, and the UK is a beacon for anti-racism around the world. Now, any Black person who lives in the UK just needs to kind of step outside our door to know that that is not real, or that is not reality. So there was pushback, but I think it, again, is linked to this sense of British exceptionalism, and actually links back to empire and colonialism, and this idea that actually we are the best, even at anti-racism, and it was a denial of the everyday lived experiences of Black people, and actually the real statistics which show that institutional racism does exist. There are all sorts of ways in which Black people's lives are seen as lesser, whether that's in medicine or sport or education, etc. So yeah, there was definitely a denial, and I know that they did kind of retrace their steps on some of the things that they put out. But yeah, it was troubling.
So maybe even with all their faults, the churches in this country have got something to teach the government about that. Everybody, we've come to the end. Thank you ever so much. Thank you so much to Patrick, Bob and Robert for being with us from the States. And thank you to, and list you all, Catherine, Mike, Richard, David, and to you, Chine, for joining us today. I hope I haven't missed anybody out. There'll be another Zoom soon. Thank you all very much indeed. Bye-bye.